In 1989, in China, college students were leading a protest against the government in Beijing. Tiananmen Square was full of them. The students had been there for about 7 weeks, and the protest had spread throughout the country to 400 cities. They were seeking government accountability, freedom of press, freedom of speech, workers to have control of their business. But eventually, the protests were forcibly subdued by the Chinese government. They ordered the military to enforce martial law, and on June 4th, Chinese troops with assault rifles and tanks inflicted hundreds to thousands of casualties on unarmed civilians. As the tanks were going through town, there was one man who did something about it. Maybe you've seen him do this. Wow. One man stopping a column of tanks by himself. One man saying, that's enough. We're not going to do this anymore. After this, the government arrested many protesters, expelled foreign reporters, controlled the coverage of this event, and this event is not allowed to be talked about in China to this day. You know, this is not the first time that individuals have put their lives on the line to protest the government. 2,500 years ago, there were 3 Jewish young men who stood up to the government of their time and said, we are going to worship who we want to worship. And we're going to read their story this morning. If you have a Bible, turn to Daniel chapter 3. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one of the chairs in front of you. It's page 627. You can look up Daniel on your phone or tablet, or if you brought your own Bible. Daniel is kind of about past halfway in the Bible. After the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, then the book of Daniel chapter 3. What the story is this. There are 3 young men that we're going to talk about today. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're from the nation of Israel. Babylon took over Israel and moved them into Babylon, where they underwent a training program for 3 years. They were taught the culture of the Babylonians, the language, and all kinds of things, and then they were put into positions of authority in the government. And what we're going to see as we read this is some things that we need to be aware of for us today, some lessons we can learn from their lives. And the first is this: we will be tested. We will be tested. In Daniel chapter 3, I'll start reading with verse 1. Here's the test these 3 young men went through. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the government officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The king set up an image of gold and said, "Hey, this thing here, this statue, you're going to bow down and worship that like I'm a god. He'd called in all the leaders of his province and said, here's what happens. We made up a song, and when this song plays, you're going to have to do this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had to make a choice. On the one hand, they had their position of power. I mean, they were up there in the government. They were overseeing the province of Babylon. They had to, on this hand, they had their wealth. It was a wealthy position. They had a lot of money and a lot of luxuries that come with that money. They had security. They had good paying jobs. And they also had their lives. And on the other hand, they had God. And they had to make a choice. Am I going to keep all of these things and bow down and worship this statue, or am I going to put my life on the line and trust in God? You know, to be a follower of Christ means that you have to be willing to count the cost, that you have to be prepared to pay a price. That's what Jesus told his followers. There's this huge crowd of people as they're following Jesus. He turns to them in Luke chapter 14, and he says this: if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Jesus said, whoever doesn't hate his family can't be my follower. Now, Jesus is not literally saying you have to hate your kids. And then you have to hate your wife. There may be sometimes they really aggravate you, but don't hate them. Because there's so many places in the Bible where it says love your family, love your spouse, love your kids. Okay, but what he's saying is, in comparison, your love of God, man, it's got to be primary. It's got to be number one. As much as you love your parents or your siblings, your love of God has to be significantly greater. You know, there are plenty of places in the world today where people are forced into that choice. They are confronted with the truth of the gospel. They are challenged to have a relationship with the God of the universe. And if they choose to follow him, their families in Muslim countries, in Hindu countries, their families will have a funeral service for them because they are dead to their families. And there are people in this world who have to make that choice today. Now, for most of us, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that if you choose to follow God with all of your heart that your family's going to hold a funeral service. But if you choose to follow God and put him first, it can cause separation in your families. Your relatives, they may not understand why you put God first. Some of you guys have relatives that are in town for Labor Day weekend and you're supposed to be out grilling or something and you're here at church and they're going, what is wrong with you? I mean, there is food to be cooked. And you guys all chose to be here, right now, listen to some crazy dude. And that's the choice that you have to make. Jesus said, if you want to be his disciple, you got to hate your family. He also said, you have to carry your cross. And in Jesus' day, carrying a cross, the cross was a symbol of execution. And what it meant was, if you're choosing the cross, you're choosing to die. And Jesus said, we have to die to ourselves to be a follower of him. That means you have to be willing to sacrifice your hopes, your dreams, your goals, and you put God first in your life. You chase after him. In a sense, that's really hard. Because it's like, well, God, sure, I want to follow you kind of in general, but really? Sacrifice? But what about the things that I want? What about the things I want to do in this life? Shouldn't those things play a part in this? And in that sense, it's really hard. In another sense, it's really easy to die to yourself because you're trusting in the God of this universe who loves you more than you can possibly even love yourself. And God is going to put you in a place of position that may be difficult, it may be hard, but it's also fulfilling. And it's one of those places where you get to know the creator of this universe. Dan Cathy was the CEO of Chick-fil-A. And he was being interviewed at a Christian event and just said in there, he said, I stand by the God's definition of marriage. And you know that a couple years ago, it just created a huge firestorm. Well, that firestorm is not done. The Denver International Airport right now, they had a vacancy, and so they opened it up to restaurants to put a new restaurant in there. And so they did a survey with customers. And it said, okay, customers, out of all the restaurants out there, what would you like to have go in this space? And number one was Chipotle. So that's kind of cool. But for whatever reasons, Chipotle didn't want to go in there. Number two was Chick-fil-A. And so Chick-fil-A said, yeah, we would like to be in there. Yeah, we'd like to do that. And they even did a report. They brought out a report, not Chick-fil-A, but the Denver airport did a report that said probably the number one retailer that would go in there, the number one restaurant that would create the most revenue for the airport would be Chick-fil-A. And so Chick-fil-A applied. But the Denver City Council said they didn't want Chick-fil-A to come in. They said that the Christian beliefs of its owner would give Denver a bad reputation. And so the City Council, which is a government entity, is going to ban a restaurant chain because of its owner's beliefs. And that is despite the fact that Chick-fil-A has never had a lawsuit against it for discriminating against customers or its employees. But when you make a stand for God, stuff is going to happen. Now, for most of us, we're probably not going to be put in a position where we're going to be on news in some fashion or something like that, but we will be tested in some way. Maybe it will be as simple as being in a conversation with someone, a friend or a family member or coworker, something like that. And as they're telling you stuff that's happening in their life, and you can just tell, man, they're really down. And as you're thinking through this, at some point you get this urge to say, you know what? Can I pray? Can I pray for you? And when you have that urge, there's a decision that you're going to have to make. Because if you say to someone, hey, can I pray for you? Can I pray for you right now? What you're saying is, I'm a follower of God, and not in the generic sense. I'm a follower of God, and I believe He is active and alive in my life, and He wants to be active and alive in yours, and I want to say words out loud to God in front of you. That's a time of testing. Because what would your friends say? What would they think about you? And we rush those things, they go back and forth in our head, and we have to make decisions. And maybe that's not going to be it, but maybe you get in a conversation with someone and you have a chance to talk about God or church or your relationship with Jesus Christ. And you have to make that choice. We will be tested, maybe not in the same way that some of these people in the Bible, but we will be tested about where we're going to stand. And we'll be tested so we will have a chance to stand. We have a chance to stand. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here in verse 8, we'll keep going on the story. At this time, so they blew the music and the trumpets and all those things. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of this music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and He will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if He does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up." That's just amazing. I mean, every time I read that thing out loud, it just sends shivers up and down my back. I mean, the king has said, they are in a culture that does not worship Jehovah God. And these three young men, they learned that culture. They learned that language. They let their names be changed to Babylonian names. They were at this gathering of the leadership. They watched the pagan ceremony, but when it came time to bow down and worship this statue, they said, we're not going to do it. We are not going to do it. And the response to me is amazing. First of all, they say to the king who has the power of life and death, they say to him, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. We're not going to defend ourselves because we answer to a much higher authority than you, king. He's the one that made this universe. And then they say, our God is able to save us. They said, you know what? You want to throw us into a furnace if we don't bow down and worship you? That's fine, because you know what? Our God is so much bigger than that. Our God could put those fires out just with a thought, and we wouldn't have any issues. He could save us from you. He is so much bigger than you, king. We don't have to worry about you. And then they say some of the most amazing words ever. But even if he doesn't save us, we're not going to bow down. It's not going to happen. And to me, that's just something that just, oh my goodness. I mean, that king was the most powerful ruler in the world at that time. And he could not force those guys to bow down. Think about that. Do you think that may have made an impression on the people around? Do you think that other people may have noticed the faith of these guys? They were able to show the people in their world that I can think for myself, I can make my own choices, I can stand against power, I can stand for my God. And that is what God calls us to do. God calls us to stand in our worlds. In Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul wrote to the church, and to the church he said this, finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. God has called us to stand in this world. Kim Davis is a county clerk in Kentucky. Recently, she has refused to issue marriage licenses to gay couples, even after the Supreme Court said it's legal. She said that her faith has kept her from attaching her name to a document endorsing gay marriage. And because of her stand, she's been put in jail, and she's been in jail for the last 3 or 4 days. Kim Davis is in a hard position. On the one hand, she has to stand for God and God's truth. She also has to fulfill the requirements for the job that she is signed up for. She also has to be a positive witness for Jesus Christ. That's a hard position to be in. There are times in our lives where we've got to stand for Jesus Christ. And for this lady, she has options. She can continue to stay in jail. She can quit her job. They can have other employees there issue the marriage licenses instead of her. But at this point, she's refused everything and just continues to stay in jail. Here's the deal. As followers of Jesus Christ, we have to stand in our societies. We need to stand up for the truth. We also need to make sure that when we are standing for Jesus Christ, it's something that draws people toward Jesus Christ and doesn't push them away. And that's hard to do. It's hard to do to be in that position, but we need to be willing to do that. See, too many times the church is seen as this group of people who stands against all these things, instead of saying, hey, there's a better option out there. A lot of people think that God's primary purpose in life is to keep us from having fun. That's what they think. And if I sign up to follow God, he is going to make me sit out in the desert somewhere, and I'm going to have to sit there and chant hymns to him all day long, and that's the extent of my life. So many people believe that. But God has set up rules, and he's set up things there to protect us, because he wants to show you that the world may live like this, But if you're my follower, you're going to live like this. And the world is chasing things that are just empty. But when we chase God, it's fulfilling. God put in the Bible, don't get drunk. It's not because he doesn't want us to have fun. It's not because he doesn't believe in parties or anything like that. God put in there, don't get drunk. And the reason for that is when we get drunk, bad stuff happens. First of all, you wake up on Sunday morning going, oh my gosh, will this preacher ever shut up? Because you've got a headache going on, because you feel sick to your stomach, and you're like, this is awful. When you get drunk, be honest, you make poor choices. Probably you can look back and go, that was a bad choice, that was a bad choice, that was a bad choice. And when you get drunk, you have regrets. You look back, you talk to your friends and say, did I really do that last night? And they go, oh yeah, check out Facebook. When you get drunk, you have the potential to hurt other people. If you get drunk and get behind the wheel of a car, you can hurt yourself and other people. And so when God says, don't get drunk, he's not saying don't have fun. He's saying you'll have more fun because you'll actually be able to remember what you did the day before. God's rules are there to protect us, to make life better. And when we stand for Jesus Christ, our goal is not to stand just against the world, but it's to show the world, hey, there's a better alternative to living. God's rules make sense when you think about them and when you follow them. We need to stand because we're going to be tested. When we're tested, we need to stand. And when we stand, the Bible says we'll be saved. There in verse 19, it goes on. Then it says, Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed, you think? He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Dude, the king was so angry because they stood up to him and said, do what you want. You can't hurt us. And the king was so angry, he ordered the furnace heated 7 times higher. The soldiers who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they burned up. They are in there, these 3 guys, and the king says, it looks like there's 4 guys in there. There's one of them, he's shining. Not because he's on fire, he's just shining with light. People think that it was either an angel or it was Jesus before he was born. And you can ask me about that later, but that's the 2 options that people see. And so the king goes to the entrance and starts shouting, hey, guys, come here. There's a preacher in Kentucky, his name was Dave Stone. I remember hearing him teach this story one time, and he said, if it was me in the furnace, and the king said, hey, come here, I would have said, what? I can't hear you, king. Come a little closer. But that's just the way he is. And so they come out, and there's no scorch marks on their clothes. Their hairs are not singed at all. They don't even smell like fire. Have you ever been around a campfire and the smoke? Okay? It's cool because it keeps the bugs away, but you smell like smoke all day. They didn't even smell like smoke. God rescued them. God saved them. There's no doubt, there's no way that it was just an accident. It's not an illusion. It wasn't something that people made up. God saved them. And it reminds me of the book of Hebrews, because Hebrews is called, in chapter 11, it's called the chapter of faith, the hall of faith. The people who followed God and stayed loyal to him. And here's what the writer of Hebrews says. He says, and what more shall I say? I don't have the time to tell you about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. God rescued them. God helped them to conquer and to overcome, and they won the battles, and they won the things that they were involved in. It reminds me of this story I heard this week of Brian Barcelona. He's out in California. He's the leader of One Voice Student Missions. And he started talking to teenagers out there about Jesus Christ and said, you know what? You need to start a Bible club at your school. Because it is totally legal for you teenagers to start a Bible club at your school. Totally legal. It's something you can do. And Brian was encouraging these young people to do that. And they ended up starting 20 different Bible clubs in schools in California with over 2,000 students coming. And the results have been just amazing. He said at one of the clubs, some gang members, former gang members stood up and said, what do I need to do to become a Christian? And the leaders and authorities in the school are coming to Brian saying, man, whatever you're doing in these clubs, keep it going, because it's changing these kids' lives. And I look at that, and it's just amazing. It's amazing to see what God can do and how he can rescue us in situations. And honestly, as a preacher, I wish I could stop right here, because this is all good. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they stand up in front of the king and they say, hey, do whatever you want. God is able to save. And God saves them. And it would be fabulous if we could just stop there. But you and I know that it doesn't always stop there. We know that when we sign up for God, we're not always on the winning side. And as you read the rest of that passage in Hebrews, it talks about those heroes of the faith. It says others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And these were all commended for their faith, yet not one of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. There are plenty of times where God's people don't win. And at some point you go, well, what's the deal? If I'm not going to win, why do I want to sign up for God? And I think that that's probably the reason that God lets us lose sometimes. Is because if every time that we won the battle because we're on God's side like that, everyone would sign up to be on God's side. And it wouldn't be about following God because they loved him. It would be about following God because he's going to give me the victory in this and that situation. And so instead, God says this. Sometimes on this earth, you're going to lose. Sometimes you're not going to win the battle. Sometimes you're going to die for your faith. And there are plenty of people in the world today that are dying for their faith. But it doesn't end there, does it? Because it says that God has something better in store. And God says no matter what it is that you're dealing with on this earth, when you stand for him, that he sees that, he notices, and in heaven, your reward is going to be assured. It's going to be assured. It's already done. It's already taken care of. God has already figured that out. And so if you get into the battle and you end up in jail for the rest of your life because you stand for him in some way, God says, you know what? No one else in this world may know. They may not see it, but I do, and you're going to be saved. Even when a Christian dies, we win because we know we get to spend eternity with God in heaven. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were tested, and they had a chance to stand and show the people of that culture that there was a better life, and they were saved. And you know what's amazing to me is Nebuchadnezzar and his reaction. In verse 28, it says this, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. If you've been following in this series, you know that when Nebuchadnezzar saw something happen really good for Daniel, then King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Oh man, your God is God. He is in charge." And now King Nebuchadnezzar is saying, "Oh man, God is in charge." Come back next week and see what happens with Nebuchadnezzar. Because here's the deal. It reminds me of something that Jesus said in Matthew 15. Jesus said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Where is your heart in regard to God? Are you constantly wanting to please him? Are you constantly wanting to pursue him? Because if you are, these other things kind of take care of themselves. If your constant desire is to put God first in your life, to truly be a disciple of Jesus, this standing up for him stuff, it's going to happen pretty naturally. If your heart is all about saying, "God, I want you number one in my life," you know what? The consequences that happen on this earth and this planet, you're not going to care about them. Because it's going to be not that big a deal at all compared to the wonder of knowing the God of this universe. So the question is going to be, where's your heart? And my hope and my prayer for you today is that you will look in your heart. You will look at what you're pursuing and say, "You know what? I do want to have God first." For some of you that are new to the faith, you don't know what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And you need someone to sit down with you and share from the Bible and share from their story about what God has done for them. And you need them to tell you, here's what it means to follow God. We have people that would love to sit down and have that conversation with you today. And so I just ask that everyone stand up where you are. If you need to have a conversation with someone about what it means to be a follower of Christ and what God has done in their lives, why don't you come meet me up front as we sing this song.